Do you remember the meals black churches used to cook for the whole community? The kind that could pull you out of bed on a Saturday morning just from the smell drifting through the fellowship hall? Today, you and I are walking back into history to savor 20 of those beloved dishes. So let's start with one of the most iconic, humble, beloved, stretch it till it feeds everybody meals ever made in a black church kitchen: neck bones and rice. You remember how that pot smelled? The minute those seasoned neck bones hit the boiling water, the entire kitchen filled with that deep, savory aroma, the kind of smell that made you hungry even if you already ate. The neck bones softened hour after hour until the meat nearly melted off. The broth thickened into a gravy that clung to the spoon, the kind that made the rice swell with flavor. Instead of just sitting on the side pretending to help, you'd scoop it onto your plate and watch the steam rise like a hymn lifting itself toward the ceiling. This wasn't a fancy cut of meat. It was one of the cheapest things you could buy. That's why churches used it. Neck bones turned scarcity into abundance. One pot could feed 20 people, 2 pots could feed 50. And when times were tight, and they usually were, those pots kept the doors open and the people full. But today, you almost never see neck bones taking center stage at a community meal. Not because they aren't loved, but because time got faster, processed food got easier, and fewer people know how to coax that kind of flavor out of scraps. It's a lost skill, almost, but not in your memory, not in the memory of anyone who grew up around a church that cooked with purpose. And tell me, when was the last time you tasted neck bones so tender they fell apart before your fork even reached them? Now let's talk about red beans and rice. The moment you hear that name, you can almost smell the slow simmer. The beans breaking down just enough to turn creamy, the holy trinity of onions, bell peppers, and celery melting into the pot, the smoky ham hock or sausage releasing its fat and flavor into every bubble. You remember how the steam felt when it hit your face as you lifted the lid too early because you couldn't help yourself. Red beans and rice wasn't just a dish, it was a ceremony. Churches cooked it because it was cheap, filling, and blessedly reliable. A single bag of dried beans cost next to nothing and could feed an entire basement full of hungry families. And the rice? That was the great equalizer. No matter how many people came through those doors, new faces, cousins, cousins of cousins, nobody ever had to worry about whether there'd be enough. Today, red beans and rice still exists, but not in that big communal way. Not in the huge metal pots stirred with a paddle. Not in a room full of elders cutting vegetables with pocket knives they carried everywhere. Not with that slow patience that made the flavors deepen in a way you can't rush. So let me ask you, if you close your eyes right now, can you still taste that first spoonful, thick, smoky, comforting, like the feeling of being cared for without anyone saying a word? Salmon croquettes. You knew they were coming. You could smell them before you even stepped into the building. The sizzle of the oil, the crisp edges, the soft, flaky center seasoned just enough to make canned salmon feel like something rich. You watched someone, maybe your auntie, maybe a church mother, mixing that salmon with crushed crackers and eggs, shaping those perfect little patties with hands that had been doing it the same way for 30 years. Fried until golden, paired with rice or grits, sometimes with white gravy poured right over the top. The thing about salmon croquettes is that they were never just food, they were survival mathematics. Canned salmon was cheap, dependable, shelf-stable, and, most importantly, protein-packed. During hard times, churches leaned on it because you could feed huge crowds with just a few cans and some pantry staples. And those croquettes didn't just fill stomachs, they sent kids to school with something solid inside them. They gave elders something warm to take home. Today, you see fancier versions, salmon cakes made with fresh fillets, remixes with herbs and aioli, but they don't hit like the ones from the church kitchen. They don't have that same crispness on the outside and softness on the inside. They don't have that same stretch every dollar energy. They don't taste like resilience. Do you remember the sound of that frying pan popping and how you waited for the first batch to come out like it was the main event of the day? Now let's step into something heartier. Smothered pork chops. You remember how those chops hit the pan with that loud crackle, sending up a burst of seasoned flour and oil that smelled like Sunday planning. The church kitchen was always loud on smothered pork chop days, skillets clanging, wood spoons tapping against cast iron, onions frying until they turned translucent and sweet. Once the chops got their color, they were tucked into a roasting pan and buried under a blanket of gravy so rich it could almost stand on its own. This meal worked because it was big, heavy, satisfying. It put something in your bones. You didn't leave hungry after smothered pork chops, not unless you were too shy to go back for seconds. And even then, someone's mama made you a plate anyway. it was also a lesson in technique. Smothering wasn't just pouring gravy over food, it was a whole science of browning, layering, and simmering until the onions broke down and the meat softened enough for even the elders with sensitive teeth to enjoy it. Compare that to today's world. People barely have time to sit down, let alone smother a chop for hours. Everything's rushed, everything's pre-cooked, and that slow, deliberate tenderness, it's fading from everyday kitchens. So tell me, do you remember cutting into a smothered pork chop so soft you didn't even need a knife? And yeah, before we settle into the next rhythm, let's talk about a meal that feels like pure memory. Chicken backs and rice. Yes, backs. The part nobody wanted until a black church kitchen turned it into a masterpiece. You remember how the back simmered for hours, releasing every bit of flavor into the broth. The meat, tiny little pockets hidden between bones, was tender and deeply seasoned, almost sweeter than the rest of the chicken. And when that broth hit the rice, it created a dish that tasted like somebody cared about you deeply. Chicken backs were cheap, sometimes free, but you'd never know that from the taste. Churches used them because they could turn almost nothing into something nourishing. For children, for elders, for entire blocks where food insecurity was normal. And back then, nobody turned their nose up at it. You ate what was provided and you appreciated the hands that made it. Tell me, when you think back on it now, do you ever wonder how something so simple could taste so rich? Now think about the smell of ham hocks and collard greens filling a church kitchen, the aroma that wrapped around you before you even pushed the door open. You remember how the greens boiled down low and slow, transforming from tough leaves into silky ribbons that soaked up every bit of smoked flavor released from those hocks. The broth, the pot liquor, shimmered as the steam rose, rich with salt, fat, vinegar, and heat. Someone always tasted it with a spoon and nodded quietly as if giving a blessing. Ham hocks were another one of those survival cuts, cheap, overlooked, and packed with flavor when you knew what to do with them. Black churches knew exactly what to do. Greens and hocks were more than a side dish. They were a meeting point of history. Collards traced back to Africa, hocks to the scraps enslaved people were forced to make do with. Together, they became a meal that stretched across generations and fed bodies as much as spirits. Today, people add turkey necks, cut the fat, go vegan, or shortcut with pre-washed bags. Nothing wrong with that, but it's different. That old school pot, heavy and simmering for hours, is fading from modern life. Do you remember leaning over the pot, letting the steam fog your glasses, and thinking nothing in the world smelled better than collards cooked with love? And then there were fried chicken livers. You can almost feel the crunch, can't you? Those little pieces, dredged in seasoned cornmeal or flour, fried until the outside turned crisp while the inside stayed tender, rich, deep, unmistakably earthy. Chicken livers were polarizing. You either loved them or avoided them, but in a church setting, you had no choice but to smell them, and that smell pulled you closer whether you confessed it or not. What made livers valuable in the church kitchen was simple: nutrition. Elders knew the iron and vitamins packed inside those pieces. During wartime and rationing, they were cheap protein. They kept people full. They kept people functioning. And in communities where medical access was limited, livers had a reputation for building you up, a practical remedy served hot. Now, most folks walk past them in the store without a second glance. They want boneless, skinless, easy, familiar. The lost art of turning organ meat into comfort food is slipping further away. But you remember the sizzle, the smell, the peppery bite. You remember someone saying, "Eat these, baby, they're good for you." So tell me, didn't chicken livers taste better when they came from a big pan set out by a church mother who'd been frying them since before you were born? Let's move to pig feet and black-eyed peas. This one takes you straight back to New Year's gatherings, revival nights, or any church event where people prayed for blessings, protection, and provision. The pig feet boiled until they reached that gelatinous, fall-apart tenderness. They weren't pretty to look at, but they were undeniably flavorful, rich, sticky, salty, with meat that practically slid off the bone. Paired with black-eyed peas cooked with ham hock or bacon, the dish tasted like history and hope served on the same plate. Black-eyed peas symbolized luck. Pig feet symbolized making the best of what you had. And when a black church cooked them together, it meant the community was stepping into a new season with strength, even if money was tight. Today, you see heritage cooking classes trying to bring pig feet back, sometimes with fancy garnishes or deconstructed presentations. But nothing touches the authenticity of a big, bubbling pot in a church kitchen, full of steam and intention. Do you remember the way the broth clung to your fingers and how the elders promised the meal would bring blessings into the coming in year? Chitlins. Now, just the word probably sends up an entire sensory memory, either the smell, the taste, or your attempt to escape the smell. Chitlins weren't a casual dish. They were a commitment. Hours of cleaning, rinsing, scraping, rinsing again, and then boiling them down until the texture softened and the flavor deepened. Some churches fried them after boiling. Some dunked them in batter. Some served them with hot sauce so sharp it woke you from the inside out. Chitlins were not for the faint of heart. They were an acquired taste layered in history, a reminder of survival, of using what was left, of making something sacred out of something discarded. Church mothers knew how to prepare them in ways younger generations rarely learn now. They treated the process like ritual, patient, careful, respectful. Today, fewer churches make chitlins. The tradition is heavy, the time commitment long, the younger members uninterested, and the health code stricter. But if you ever tasted church chitlins, you know how unmistakable that flavor was. Deep, savory, almost smoky, carrying the weight of centuries. So tell me, do you remember standing outside the kitchen doorway, hoping the smell wouldn't cling to your clothes before service started? Now let's talk about neck meat stew, not neck bones, neck meat, the beef kind. The heavier, richer, thicker kind simmered with vegetables until it transformed into something that hugged your ribs from the inside. The stew bubbled low and steady, the neck meat releasing collagen that thickened the broth naturally. Every chunk of carrot, potato, celery, and onion softened under that slow heat, absorbing flavor until each bite tasted like hours of care. Neck meat was affordable. It was also structured fundamentally differently from tender cuts. The connective tissue needed time to break down, time that church kitchens had, especially on days when volunteers spent the whole afternoon prepping for an evening program. This stew warmed you, sustained you, stitched you back together after a long week. And the contrast with today is clear. Instant pots, canned soups, fast meals that never quite reach that slow simmer depth. The patience required for neck meat stew is rare now. It's a dying craft. Do you remember dipping cornbread into the pot, letting it soak up the broth until it collapsed into complete perfection? Now imagine salmon patties with white gravy. Not croquettes this time, patties ladled with that creamy, peppery, milk-based gravy poured right over the top until your plate looked like comfort served in edible form. The patties were crisp on the edges, hot in the center, and the gravy softened everything just enough to make each bite feel like home. This dish came from a time when food had to stretch. Canned salmon was accessible, dependable, and forgiving. Churches used it because you could double or triple a recipe without losing flavor. The gravy made the meal heavier, richer, more satisfying. It turned a simple patty into a plate that filled stomachs and calmed spirits. Today's versions, healthier, lighter, more modern. But that peppery white gravy, thick enough to cling to the spoon, thin enough to drip over the sides, is something very few kitchens still make the old way. Do you remember cutting through that crisp patty and watching the gravy pool around your fork? Now picture a pot of smothered cabbage with salt pork. The cabbage wilted down into soft, pale green ribbons, flavored by little cubes of salty pork that crackled as they rendered. The onions turned sweet. The steam filled the room. The dish was simple but bold, savory, comforting, deeply satisfying. Salt pork was cheap, flavorful, and able to season huge volumes of vegetables. Churches used it because cabbage went a long way and fed large groups for next to nothing. This dish was especially common in the winter when produce was limited and budgets were tight. Today, cabbage still shows up, but not like this. Not in giant church pots with salt pork popping in the bottom. Do you remember watching someone lift the lid and stir the cabbage, releasing a bifatida cloud of steam that smelled like family? Let's move to something that felt more luxurious, even though it started as scraps. Oxtails and gravy. Oh, the tenderness, the richness, the marrow, the deep brown gravy produced by hours of simmering. When oxtails were cheap, churches bought them in bulk. They took time, long time, but the payoff was enormous. The meat fell off in silky strands, the gravy thickened into something you wanted to lick from the spoon, and the entire dish tasted like patience rewarded. Now oxtails cost more than steak. They've become a delicacy, but back then they were survival cooking elevated into celebration food. Do you remember the way elders closed their eyes after the first bite, like the flavor carried them somewhere sacred? And then there was the fried fish, usually whiting or catfish, the kind sold right out of a church window on a Friday night. You remember that smell before anything else. The hot oil, the cornmeal, the seasoning that every church claimed they had perfected. The fish came out golden, edges curled crisp, steam rising from inside when you broke it open. People lined up for it, cars pulled up. Word traveled faster than the announcements at the pulpit. What made fried fish so essential was its simplicity and speed. It was one of the few meals that allowed a church to raise money, feed the neighborhood, and do it all without needing hours of prep. A good fryer, a few volunteers, and a batch of fresh fillets were enough to keep the whole block satisfied. The crunch, the heat, the lemon squeezed over the top, the slice of white bread tucked beside it. It wasn't just food, it was community economics, a fundraiser you could taste. Today, you can still buy fried fish, but you don't see the church versions as often. The ones seasoned by hand, passed through cornmeal by someone who didn't measure anything because experience was the measurement. Can you still hear the hiss of that fryer and the laughter of the deacons working the window? Next comes liver and onions. This was the meal that made you feel like the elders were looking after your health, even if they never said it outright. The liver soaked beforehand to temper its strong flavor, then dredged lightly in flour and fried until browned. The onions caramelized until sweet, then smothered the liver in a glossy, fragrant layer that balanced everything out. Black churches served this because liver was both inexpensive and medicinal in spirit, rich in iron, nutrients, and old school wisdom. People believed it strengthened the blood, energized the tired, and restored people who had been working too hard for too long. The kitchen became a place of nourishment in every sense. Today, many folks won't touch liver, the texture, the smell, the old-fashioned feel of it. But back then, you ate it whether you wanted to or not, and often found yourself enjoying it more than you expected. Do you remember how the onions softened the bitterness and made each bite taste like someone cared enough to fix you something good for your body? Now imagine hot water cornbread being shaped by hand, quick, rough, practiced movements. Cornmeal poured into a bowl, salt, maybe a little sugar, and then the key, boiling water. Poured in slowly until the mixture turned into a thick, hot dough. Mothers and grandmothers dipped their fingers in cold water, then formed those little patties and slipped them into hot oil where they puffed and crisped. Hot water cornbread was born from scarcity. No eggs, no milk, no buttermilk. Things people didn't always have. Just cornmeal and boiling water. Churches relied on it because it was fast, cheap, and perfect for soaking up gravies and stews. And it tasted like history. Crispy edges, soft inside. The kind of bread you ate with your hands because forks were just in the way. Today's cornbread is softer, sweeter, cakier. It's different, but nothing replaces that fried patty made with nothing but necessity and skill. Do you remember picking up a piece so hot you had to toss it from hand to hand? Next comes crackling cornbread. This was the louder, crunchier cousin of the traditional version. Bits of pork cracklings, fried pieces of fat, and skin from hog butchering, folded into the batter before baking or frying. Each bite had texture, salt, richness, and that savory surprise that made you pause mid-chew. Crackling cornbread was a staple in rural black churches, especially during hog killing season when nothing went to waste. It symbolized abundance, efficiency, tradition, and celebration all at once. The cracklings added flavor bombs that transformed simple cornmeal into something feast-worthy. Today, cracklings are harder to find and fewer people know how to incorporate them. But if you ever tasted that cornbread fresh from the oven, the edges crisp, the inside hot and studded with browned pork pieces, you know it's unforgettable. Do you remember biting into a piece and hearing that tiny crunch echo in your ears? Sugarbread came next. Not fancy, not complex, but powerful in how it created joy out of almost nothing. You remember the process. A slice of cheap white bread, butter smeared edge to edge, sugar sprinkled thick enough to sparkle, folded over, sometimes broiled just a second, sometimes eaten soft. This was church dessert when money was tight and children needed a treat. It taught you something. Sweetness didn't have to be expensive. Pleasure didn't have to be complicated. And joy didn't depend on having a lot. It depended on sharing what little you had. Today, kids are surrounded by every dessert imaginable. Cupcakes with edible glitter, designer cookies, ice cream flavors you can't even pronounce. But none of it hits like that simple slice of sugar bread handed to you by an elder who winked and said, "Don't tell nobody I gave you this." Do you remember licking your fingers afterwards so you wouldn't waste a single grain? Now think about bread pudding, made not from fresh bread but from bread that was almost too far gone. Stale slices, torn by hand, soaked in milk, sugar, butter, and eggs until they softened into a custard-like mixture that baked into something warm and heavy with sweetness, cinnamon, nutmeg, raisins, if the budget allowed. Bread pudding came from the belief that nothing should go to waste, not food, not time, not effort. Black churches embodied that belief. They took stale bread and transformed it into a dessert that tasted like abundance. It filled the room with warmth. It fed dozens. It felt like a hug on a plate. Today, bread pudding is sold in restaurants as a luxury item, sometimes topped with caramel sauce or bourbon glaze. It's dressed up now. But the church version, soft in the middle, crisp on top, smelling like everything good about home, will always be the standard. Do you remember scraping the edges of the pan because that was the best part? And then there was carrot and yam souffle. This dish felt fancy even though it was rooted in thrift. Yams and carrots boiled until soft, mashed with sugar, eggs, and cream, then baked into a fluffy, sweet, lightly spiced side that bordered on dessert. The top browned, the inside stayed velvety, and the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the room like holiday spirit. This meal drew from West African yam traditions, sweetness, warmth, celebration, and fused them with Southern church cooking. It was comfort layered with history, and because it was affordable, churches could serve it for big occasions without straining the budget. Today, soufflés exist mostly in upscale restaurants or holiday tables, but when a church made it, it felt like eating clouds flavored with memory. Do you remember that first spoonful melting the moment it touched your tongue? At this point, you've walked through 18 meals, 18 memories, each a small universe built inside a church kitchen. But there are two more that tie everything together, not because they were extravagant, but because they were grounding. Cornbread, simple, classic, essential, was one. Whether baked, skillet fried, or made from a mix, it showed up at every church event. Cornbread absorbed gravy, extended meals, filled hungry bellies, and made even the humblest dish feel complete. It held history in its texture. And rice, plain white rice, but not really plain, was the other. Churches used rice because it stretched everything: gravy dishes, bean dishes, meat dishes. Rice was the quiet backbone of countless meals. But the truth is, none of these foods mattered only because they tasted good. They mattered because of what they did. They fed entire communities physically, emotionally, culturally, spiritually. They preserved history. They offered dignity when the world didn't. They created moments that stay with you even now. Do you realize now how these meals weren't just food, but memories that raised you? So here you are, standing in the doorway of all these memories, holding a plate that isn't really a plate. It's a timeline, a story, a map of where you come from, who fed you, and how entire communities survived by gathering in church kitchens that doubled as lifelines. And before we close this journey, I want to walk with you through the final two meals that anchored everything. The ones that always showed up, the ones that meant the food was ready, the gathering was real, and the love was present. Hot water cornbread, you remember. Crackling cornbread, you remember. But regular cornbread, the kind baked in a cast iron skillet that had seen more services than the pastor, was its own ministry. You knew it by the sound, a metal spatula scraping the bottom of the pan to loosen the crisp edges. When the pan was flipped, the cornbread came out steaming, golden, smelling like warmth and history. It wasn't just bread. It was the foundation that grounded every plate in the room. It absorbed neckbone gravy. It balanced the salt of ham hocks. It softened the heat of fish seasoning. It turned a ladle of beans into a full meal. And it didn't take much to make it. Cornmeal, a little flour, a little sugar, or none at all depending on who was in charge. A splash of oil, some milk, or water if that's all you had. The ingredients were humble. The power was not. This was food that steadied you, made you feel like even when the world outside was unpredictable, the church kitchen could always be relied on for something steady and familiar. And then there was rice. Not the fancy pilaf or wild rice blends of today, just white rice, rinsed clean, boiled in a big metal pot, fluffed with a long-handled spoon. You could smell the steam rising each time the lid was lifted. The grains clumped a little because the pot stayed on warm too long, but nobody cared, because rice was the quiet hero. It carried neckbone gravy. It patted out red beans. It turned salmon croquettes into full plates for big families who needed the food to last for days. Churches didn't serve rice because it was exciting. They served it because it was essential. It filled stomachs when money was thin. It stretched meals that would have otherwise fed too few. And most importantly, it acted like a canvas on which every other flavor in the kitchen could shine. Do you remember someone scooping rice onto your plate and shaking the spoon to level it off, like they were setting a foundation for everything else you were about to receive? When you put all 20 meals together, neck bones and rice, red beans and rice, salmon croquettes, smothered pork chops, chicken backs and rice, ham hocks and collards, fried livers, pig feet and peas, chitlins, neck meat stew, salmon patties with gravy, smothered cabbage, oxtails and gravy, fried fish, liver and onions, hot water cornbread, crackling cornbread, sugar bread, bread pudding, carrot and yam souffle. You see a story far bigger than food. So go down to the comments and tell the one meal your church did better than anybody, or the one that instantly takes you back to wooden pews, white gloves, fans with funeral home ads on the back, and the sound of a kitchen coming alive downstairs. And while you're there, hit like so this story reaches more people who need to be reminded of where they came from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next journey back into the memories you haven't thought about in years. And share this with someone who used to sit next to you at those church tables, passing plates and laughing like the world outside didn't exist. Because these meals weren't just cooked for the whole community, they built the whole community. And remembering them keeps that community alive. Do you ever stop and wonder what happened to the recipes your mama made without ever opening a cookbook? The ones that smelled like Sunday mornings, tasted like home, and somehow healed everything from heartbreak to hunger. The kind of food that wasn't just cooked, but remembered? This is a journey back to that kitchen. The one with the chipped counters, the loud laughter, and that faint hum of Al Green in the background. You can almost hear the oil sizzling, feel the heat rising from the stove, and smell something you can't quite name but instantly trust. This isn't just about food. It's about memory, inheritance, and the kind of love you could taste before you ever said grace. Let's go back to the 25 recipes Black mothers taught their children, the ones we've somehow let slip away. You remember the first one, cornbread, not that boxed mix that tastes like sugar cake, but real cast iron cornbread, the kind where your mama poured bacon grease in the pan first, let it heat until it hissed, then poured the batter in so it crisped up golden around the edges. You could smell it all the way from the porch. That smell meant dinner was ready, the day was winding down, and everything in the world was right again. Back then, cornbread wasn't a side, it was the heart of the table. Today, it's rare to see a young one pull out buttermilk or stone ground cornmeal. Everything's boxed, quick, digital, but you can't microwave that sound, that crust snapping when it's cut. Do you still remember that sound? And then there was smothered chicken, not fried, not baked, smothered. That meant you seasoned it heavy, salt, pepper, garlic, maybe a little paprika, then browned it slow until the skin talked back at the skillet. Then came the gravy, made from scratch, pulled from the same pan dripping. Mama didn't measure, she felt it. Flour, broth, onions, and thyme. It would bubble low and thick until the whole house smelled like comfort. Back then, that dish meant stay a while. You'd sit down with rice or mashed potatoes, soaking up every drop. These days, we scroll while eating, rushing through meals that used to take half a day. But do you remember when dinner was the event, not the interruption? Next came collard greens with smoked turkey or neck bone. The smell alone told a story. That pot would simmer all day, and you knew not to lift the lid too much or mama would fuss. She'd throw in vinegar, red pepper flakes, maybe a pinch of sugar if the greens were too bitter. And when it was done, that broth at the bottom, the pot liquor, that was gold. That was history, vitamins, flavor, and pride all in one. Mama would say, "Don't you dare throw that out." You'd soak it up with cornbread, close your eyes, and feel the ancestors nod. Now, too many folks reach for kale chips and forget that greens used to be our slow anthem, proof that good things take time. Do you remember the patience of waiting for that pot to finish? Then there was sweet potato pie, not pumped sweet potato. You could always tell who knew what they were doing by the way they mashed the potatoes smooth. Butter, sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, vanilla, and just a whisper of lemon to brighten it up. The crust wasn't store-bought. It was rolled on a floured counter with love and maybe a few words of prayer. When that pie came out the oven, the smell wrapped the whole house in Thanksgiving and childhood all at once. And when it cooled, Mama would slice it slow, making sure the first piece didn't fall apart. You'd get that taste, creamy, spiced, soulful. Now you see store-bought pies stacked in plastic, no story behind them, no fingerprints of love. Can you still remember what that first bite felt like? Warm and sweet, like being safe again. And then black-eyed peas, the New Year's tradition, cooked low and slow with smoked meat, onions, and that one bay leaf Mama said brought luck. She didn't play about that bay leaf. Those peas weren't just food, they were a ritual. Eat them for prosperity, she'd say. You didn't know what that meant back then, but you did it anyway. You learned faith through flavor, belief through habit. Nowadays, folks forget. They skip the pot, skip the prayer. But when that spoon hit your mouth back then, you tasted hope. Do you still cook hope? Fried catfish. That was Saturday night food. Cornmeal dusted, hot grease popping, fish sizzling in the cast iron. Mama had a rhythm. Drop, wait, flip, drain. It came out golden and crisp, never greasy. Served with white bread, hot sauce, maybe coleslaw on the side. The smell would drift out the screen door, calling the neighborhood neighborhood like a song. That sound of the grease crackling was music. You didn't need fancy meals. You just needed that plate. Now fish gets baked, air fried, or forgotten. But when's the last time you ate something that reminded you of who you are? Then there was okra stew. Slimy if you didn't know what you were doing, but Mama did. She'd mix it with tomatoes, onions, maybe shrimp or sausage, and cook it until it melted into something thick, earthy, and comforting. That dish taught patience, taught technique. You couldn't rush okra. You had to learn balance, heat, time. The smell was herbal, tangy, and deep, like the South itself. These days, okra's almost gone from kitchen, too messy for modern life. But do you remember when cooking was messy and beautiful? Rice pudding came next, the sweet cousin of struggle food. Leftover rice turned into dessert with milk, eggs, sugar, raisins, and nutmeg. Nothing wasted, everything cherished. The oven would hum, the top would brown, and that smell. It felt like bedtime stories and hand-me-down quilts. You learn love in those leftovers. Now, leftovers get tossed without a thought. Have we forgotten how to make something special from what's left behind? And, oh, gumbo. That wasn't a recipe, it was a ceremony. Rue made darkest coffee, stirred slow so it didn't burn. That was a test of patience. Okra, shrimp, sausage, crab, onions, celery, bell pepper. The holy trinity of flavor. Every house had its version, its secret. It wasn't just about what was in the pot, it was about who was in the house. Neighbors dropping by, laughter spilling over, stories being told between bites. That pot didn't just feed stomachs, it fed bonds. You can't DoorDash that. Do you still remember what togetherness tastes like? Finally, candied yams. Sweet, sticky, glossy with caramelized butter and brown sugar, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, sometimes topped with marshmallows if Mama felt fancy. It wasn't just dessert, it was abundance on a plate. You'd eat them slow, savoring that syrup that dripped into your dressing and made everything taste better. These days, folks cut sugar, cut corners, cut time. But back then, sweetness was a language. Do you still speak it? You see, these recipes weren't just meals. They were love letters, written in grease stains and wooden spoons. Each one carried history, from the fields to the freedom table. And every black child who ever stood on a kitchen stool to stir the pot was learning more than cooking. They were learning survival. They were learning care. Now, so many of those flavors are fading, traded for convenience, speed, and silence. But food, especially our food, was never just about hunger. It was about healing. You can almost hear your mama's voice again, can't you? Taste it. Tell me what it needs. Tell me, what's the first dish that takes you home? You remember macaroni and cheese, not the boxed kind with powdered orange dust, but the baked one that was a masterpiece every Sunday. Mama would start by boiling elbow macaroni, careful not to overcook it. Then she'd build that sauce from scratch. Real butter, evaporated milk, a mix of sharp cheddar, Colby, and a touch of Velveeta to make it stretch. She didn't need a recipe. She had instinct. That bubbling golden top that came out the oven, that was more than food. That was ceremony. You'd wait for it to cool just enough so the cheese stretched when you lifted your fork. Back then, every family reunion had a mac and cheese queen, and if hers didn't hit right, the whispers started before dessert. These days, folks grab pre-made trays or toss it in an air fryer. But tell me, do you still remember the joy of scraping the crispy corners for that last piece of perfection? Then there was fried cabbage. You'd hear that sizzle before you smelled it. Butter melting down, onions frying soft, cabbage ribbons going in, then that dash of vinegar to make it sing, maybe some bacon bits for flavor. The pan steamed and crackled, filling the kitchen with a sweet, tangy perfume that clung to your clothes. Mama always said, cabbage will keep you humble and fed. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of flavor, of memory, of meaning. These days, cabbage barely makes it to the table, replaced by kale salads that don't know the sound of a skillet. But do you remember when the cheapest things tasted the richest? And red beans and rice. That was Monday's meal, every week without fail. A pot of beans cooked down until creamy, seasoned with smoked sausage or ham hock, garlic, and a bay leaf. The rice, perfectly steamed, wasn't a side. It was part of the soul of the dish. Mama would start that pot early, let it simmer all day while she ironed, cleaned, and hummed under her breath. By dinner time, the whole house smelled like warmth itself. It was poor folks' food made royal. Now, fast foods replaced it and slow foods forgotten. But when you smell that mix of beans, smoke, and thyme, doesn't your heart still remember to slow down? Then came hot water cornbread. Simple but sacred. Cornmeal, salt, hot water. That's it. Mixed into patties and fried golden brown in oil until crisp on the outside, soft inside. It was the bridge between nothing and something. If there wasn't much else, there was always that. Mama would fry them while humming, her hands steady, her patience unshakable. You'd grab one hot off the plate and burn your tongue because you couldn't wait. That flavor, a little salt, a lot of love. Nowadays, people call it old-fashioned, but old-fashioned was what kept us full. When's the last time you tasted simplicity done perfectly? Then there was oxtail stew. That one took all day. You'd brown those oxtails in oil until the house smelled like Sunday. Then add broth, onions, garlic, and thyme, letting it all simmer until the meat fell right off the bone. The gravy turned rich, almost silky, with flavors that seemed deeper than the pot itself. Served over rice or mashed potatoes, it felt like luxury built out of scraps. Mama used to say, "We learned to make the hard cuts taste like heaven." Now, oxtails are high-end, sold in fancy restaurants, but the secret always belonged to her. Do you remember when struggle food was transformed by skill, not money? Chitterling, or chitlin, if you really knew. That smell hit first, strong, stubborn, unforgettable. You could smell it down the block. Cleaning them was an all-day job. Boiling, rinsing, cleaning again. But when Mama was done and they simmered with onions, vinegar, and pepper, something magical happened. It wasn't about the taste, it was about pride. It said, "We made something out of nothing." You didn't always love them, but you respected them. Today, most folks turn their noses up, but that smell, that unmistakable, unapologetic scent of heritage, that's a whole history lesson. Do you remember how love sometimes didn't smell sweet but stayed strong anyway? Next, buttermilk biscuit, the real one, soft, flaky, layered with years of practice. Mama never used a cutter, just her hands. Flour dust in the air, dough folded and pressed with love. When they came out of the oven, hot and golden, she'd brush the tops with butter until they glistened. You'd pull one apart, steam rise, and watch that butter melt right through. Served with syrup, molasses, or sausage gravy. It didn't matter. It felt like morning. Now biscuits come in cans that pop open, but can you still recall the sound of real dough being patted by hand? Chicken and dumpling. That was the definition of comfort. Chicken simmered until tender. Broth turned thick and creamy. Dumplings dropped in like clouds. You'd hear the gentle bubbling, smell the mix of thyme, onion, and love. That dish hugged you from the inside. On cold nights, it wasn't just food, it was warmth, faith, and peace in a bowl. Today, we sip instant soups, forgetting that soup used to take hours, not seconds. Can you still remember what patience tastes like? Then there was banana pudding. Not the instant one, but the real deal. Homemade custard layered with vanilla wafers and sliced bananas, topped with meringue brown just right. Mama would chill it and tell you not to touch it yet, though you'd sneak a spoonful anyway. The first bite was soft, sweet, and soothing, like forgiveness. The smell of bananas and vanilla still makes your chest ache with memory. Now it's just pudding cups and whipped cream. But tell me, do you still crave the one that had your fingerprints in the bowl? And beef neckbone stew. Poor man's meal turned master, simmered slow with onions, carrots, potatoes, and a dark broth that could make you close your eyes in gratitude. Those bones gave flavor nothing else could. Mama said it was meat with meaning. You'd eat it with rice or cornbread, making sure not to waste a drop. These days, neck bones are forgotten, but back then, they were a symbol of thrift, of art, of endurance. Can you still hear the spoon scraping the last bit of gravy off the plate? Then came sweet tea, cold, dark, and strong enough to hold a spoon. Mama would brew it on the stove, pour it over sugar while it was hot so it dissolved just right, then chill it until beads of sweat formed on the glass. You drink it on the porch, the world slowing down with each sip. It wasn't just tea, it was time, a pause, a permission to rest. Now tea comes bottled, sterile, soulless. But can you still remember how it felt when time tasted sweet? You see, every one of these recipes was more than nourishment. They were lessons in patience, gratitude, and faith. Each dish told you how to survive with dignity, how to feed a family on spirit when the wallet was thin. They were the flavors of resilience. Mama never said, "I love you much." She showed it through pots that simmered, bread that rose, pies that cooled on windowsills. That was her language. Food as affection. So when we forget these recipes, we're not just losing ingredients. We're losing stories, memories, and the quiet ways love used to speak. You can still hear the echo of it if you listen close. The scrape of a spoon, the hum of a woman cooking without hurry. You remember bread pudding, that miracle of a dessert made from what most folks would throw away. Stale bread, milk, eggs, sugar, cinnamon, raisins, baked until golden and soft. When Mama made it, the whole kitchen smelled like mercy. Sweet, warm, forgiving. Nothing was ever wasted. Everything had a second chance. She'd drizzle it with homemade vanilla sauce, thick and glossy, and it felt like a hymn when you tasted it. You learned more than cooking from that dish. You learned redemption. These days, people toss out bread without a thought, forgetting how something old could still be made new. Tell me, do you still remember how good second chances taste? Then came pork chops and gravy. The sound of that skillet popping was the sound of joy. Mama would dredge each chop in flour, salt, and pepper, then fry them until crisp and brown. The drippings left in the pan were sacred. That's where the gravy was born. She'd whisk in flour, milk, and patience until it turned smooth, rich, and soulful. Served with rice or mashed potatoes, it was a masterpiece built from everyday things. Now people bake them dry, rush them fast, miss the soul in the sizzle. But do you remember when that first bite felt like home sitting heavy on your tongue? Lima beans and ham hocks, slow cooked until the beans were tender, creamy, and infused with the deep smoke smoky taste of the meat. Mama would season it with onions, a little garlic, and a sprinkle of pepper flake. It wasn't flashy, just honest. You'd spoon it up, feel it fill you slow, steady, sure. That pot sat on the back burner half the day, humming like a steady song. These days, slow cooking's gone out of fashion, replaced by pressure cookers and fast fixes, but patience made flavor. Do you remember when waiting was part of the recipe? Then candied apples, sticky, glossy red, cooling on wax paper. Mama would dip each apple in that boiling sugar syrup, her hands steady, her eyes sharp. The smell, sweet and sharp, caramelized sugar and childhood in the air. You couldn't wait to bite it, even though you knew it'd stick to your teeth. Fairs, school festivals, autumn afternoons, they all smelled like that. Today, we buy snacks wrapped in plastic, all identical, all hollow. But can you still taste the sweetness that left your lips stained red? Mama made it with what was fresh, what was available. It was her way of saying, we make do. Now, we chase imported things and forget the magic in what's near us. Do you remember when local wasn't a label, just life? Every dish was a story, every story a thread in something larger, community. Mama didn't just feed a household, she fed a whole history. Food wasn't about recipe, it was about remembering who we were when we had nothing but each other. And when you sat down at that table, whether it was a feast or a humble meal, you always said grace, because gratitude wasn't just for the good times, it was for the simple ones. That's what these recipes were, gratitude made edible. And now, as so many of these flavors fade, we have to ask ourselves, what are we passing down in their place? Are we giving our children the taste of tradition or just convenience? The kitchen used to be the heartbeat of the home, where laughter, discipline, and faith all happened over a hot stove. Now it's quiet, stainless steel, life. But maybe it's not too late. Maybe one day you'll roll up your sleeves, turn on the radio, and make one of those dishes again, by memory, not measurement. Tell me, when was the last time a smell made you cry? These days, breakfast is protein bars and screens, but do you remember when history sat on your plate and you ate it proudly? That's what all of this was about, pride. Black mothers didn't just teach recipes, they taught resilience disguised as dinner. They turned scarcity into abundance, bitterness into beauty, leftovers into love. They measured nothing, yet every dish was perfect, because perfection wasn't the goal, nourishment was. Every stir, every simmer, every burnt fingertip was a language. You didn't need to ask if she loved you, you could taste it, you could smell it before you even reached the kitchen door. And now, as those recipes fade, what remains isn't just the loss of food, it's the loss of memory. The kind of memory that tied families together across generations, that said, we made it before and we'll make it again. But you can still bring it back. You can still find that old cast iron skillet, still fry something slow, still hum a tune your mama used to sing under her breath. You can still fill your kitchen with the same smell that once filled hers. Maybe you'll burn the first batch, maybe you'll forget the spice, but maybe, just maybe, someone younger will walk by, smell it, and stop, because something deep in their bones will recognize it. That's how tradition survives, not by perfection, but by repetition, by remembering, by cooking, by loving. So maybe it's time to pick one recipe, just one, and bring it back. Make it the way she did. Taste it, close your eyes, and listen for her voice, because the truth is, those recipes aren't lost. They're waiting in the flour canister, in the bottom of your memory, in that one skillet you never threw away. And when you cook them again, she's there, standing right beside you, wiping her hands on that same old apron, saying softly, that's how it's done, baby. When you think back, you realize it was never just about the food. It was about rhythm. The way your mother moved around that kitchen like she'd rehearsed it her whole life. The shuffle of slippers on linoleum, the hiss of oil, the hum of an old gospel record in the background. You didn't need a recipe card to understand that she was creating something bigger than dinner. She was preserving the language. Every stir, every taste, every sprinkle of salt was her way of saying, I love you, I've got you, and you're going to be all right. Back then, food wasn't fast. It was patient. A pot of greens could simmer all day. A pound cake took the better part of an afternoon. It was an unspoken rule that flavor took time, that love did too. Today, everything is instant. Instant meals, instant messages, instant everything. But those dishes your mother made, they reminded you that some things can't be rushed. She taught you that seasoning doesn't come from a packet, but from the soul. That it's not about the brand of butter, but the care that melts it into the pan. And maybe that's what's been lost most of all. The patience to sit still long enough for something to mean something, because her recipes weren't written down. They were lived. She didn't measure. She remembered. Just a pinch, she'd say. A little more till it feels right. You'd stand there, watch, thinking you'd never forget how she did it. But then life got loud. The world sped up, and somewhere between the drive-through line and the late nights, you realized how much you missed that slow magic. The truth is, Black mothers didn't just feed their children, they fortified them. Those meals were protection, culture, prayer, and poetry all rolled into one. A pot of beans wasn't just dinner, it was a reminder of survival. Fried chicken wasn't just just a recipe. It was a ritual. Sweet potato pie wasn't just dessert. It was identity. Every flavor carried history, whispers from grandmothers who worked fields and kitchens and still made time to feed their families with pride. You didn't just eat her food, you inherited it. Now the challenge is keeping it alive, not as nostalgia, but as practice. When you cook those recipes again, when you stir the pot the way she did, taste it, close your eyes and say, almost. You bring her back. You carry her through time, through distance, through generations. You remind yourself, and whoever's sitting at your table, that love, real love, is often simmering on the stove long before you taste it. So maybe tonight, instead of ordering takeout, you roll up your sleeves. You pull out that old cast iron skillet, maybe a little worn but still sturdy. You make her biscuits. You fry that chicken. You season those greens the way you remember, or maybe the way you feel. You let the house fill up with the smell of what used to be, because that smell, that's memory cooking itself into the walls again. And when you sit down to eat, don't rush. Take a bite, close your eyes, let it hit you. That deep, quiet knowing that you've just done something sacred. You've brought her back for a moment, you've kept the story alive. So here's the truth. Recipes fade, memories blur, but taste remembers. And if you ever find yourself missing her, all you have to do is cook, because every time you do, she's right there, humming soft, wiping her hands on that old towel and smiling like she never left. If you still remember even one of her recipes, write it down, pass it on, let it live again, because love, real love, always finds its way back to the table. Those flavors weren't just food, they were history, love, and lessons disguised as dinner. If this stirred up a memory, don't let it fade. Be sure to click on the card showing on the screen as you pass it on and keep her kitchen alive, because every recipe you remember keeps her voice alive too.